Good morning.
Morning.
I was told in first service that my head was cut off on the camera the entire time, so I'm going to move this back a little bit. That's probably not the worst view, only having to see half my face. It's good to be back with you guys. Last weekend we were gone. We did a little family road trip, which was exciting and terrifying, and we all four made it back alive. So that's the good news. I know some of you guys were like, I'm not sure if he's going to be a pastor after he gets back from this road trip. But I win. So no, we had a great time. We went to Park City for a couple of days, and then we went to Idaho, right outside of Boise. We just started a campus there about 6 weeks ago, South Hills, Idaho. They meet in a town called Eagle, which is where every Californian is moving right now. So it's full of Californians, but we got to go out with Pastor Randy. He's out there, and his wife Hansi. They're doing an incredible job, and it was so cool to be able to see just the way that God is continuing to move there locally, but also use South Hills as an organization to continue reaching people that are disconnected from community, disconnected from God, from their faith. Selfishly, it was kind of fun to be there because we gave them our old box truck from when we were a mobile campus, and it was raining. And so when I pulled up in time for church, I was like, you guys had to unload everything, and we have our own building. We don't have to set anything up. And then, oh yeah, that's right, we meet outside now too, so that's cool. No, it was a great time being out there. Pastor Moses was here, which is always fun to be able to hear the stories about the crazy things that Pastor Moses says. But we started this brand new series. Let me set my timer here so I don't cut into lunch. I got to make sure we end on time. But we started a brand new series last week called No Thanks, and we're talking about the idea of thankfulness and gratitude, and what does that look like for us to be able to cultivate that. We talked last week about the difference between feeling thankful and saying thank you, the difference between feeling grateful and actually practicing gratitude, making it external to the people around us, and how crucial that is, how important that is, not only for ourselves, but ultimately that the power of expressing and practicing gratitude not only changes ourselves, but also the people around us. There's a ton of other physical benefits, social benefits, psychological benefits to gratitude. We've been doing a lot of research on studies over the last couple weeks. Physically, when grateful people have stronger immune systems, less body pains and aches, optimum blood pressure and cardiac function, and better sleep-wake cycles. So that's cool. Socially, grateful people have better communication, more empathy, stronger relationships, and they are more likable, which isn't that surprising that grateful people would be more likable. Psychologically, gratitude reduces fear and anxiety. It helps regulate stress hormones. When we express gratitude, our brain releases dopamine and serotonin, which are responsible for our emotions. They help us feel better. They enhance our mood. And I just think grateful people look better. So if none of the other stuff seems like a benefit, let's just kind of keep the benchmark really low. So we talked about the importance of gratitude. We talked about the importance of not only feeling it, but what does it mean for us to say it, to practice it, to put it into action of saying I'm grateful, saying thank you, communicating the things that we're grateful for. But today, I wanted to try and answer the question, and it's going to go a little bit dark here, but I'm going to try and bring it back up, okay? So just bear with me. But the question, how could I be grateful in a year like this? Because I know probably most of us have had a version of that thought. Thankfulness, gratitude, yes, but also this year. Let's just be honest. This has been a difficult year. And you may be thinking, Chris, I have no problem saying thank you out loud, even if there was something to say thank you for. If there was a string of positive events instead of a string of catastrophes. If there was just maybe 1 week where nothing changed in our world and we got to just build some sense of normalcy. The cards have not been really falling my way this year. What am I supposed to be grateful for? For quarantine, for financial strain, for relational tension, for the political cycle, for COVID? What is it exactly that I'm supposed to express gratitude for? And I think that there is a kind of a rift or a chasm in our understanding of gratitude. Because for many of us, we think that we need something to fuel the feeling of gratitude. We think that we need to have something happen that would trigger us to feel grateful. We need to have something happen that helps us remember to feel grateful, or that actually makes us feel grateful. When we were in Idaho, we rented an Airbnb, this house. It was a cool house. It had 2 fireplaces, which is how cold it gets in Idaho. And I was reminded at how incredibly mediocre I am at starting fires and keeping them going. It's a challenge, but it also didn't help that I was buying just the firewood from the grocery store, which is how you know that you're a tourist, because that stuff burns forever. The first day we went, and I just got 1 bundle, and I was like, oh, this will last for a long time. And then like 17 minutes later, I was out of firewood. And it was literally like I just kept taking logs and like throwing them on the fire and feeding this fire and feeding this fire. And I think for some of us, we have the same experience with gratitude. I think that we kind of live under the impression that something needs to happen for me to feel grateful. Something needs to happen for me to feel thankful. Something needs to feed this flame of gratitude in my life. Otherwise, it's just going to go out. And if we're honest about 2020, it feels like there's not been a whole lot of firewood. There's not been a whole lot feeding that fire. We feel this tension in our hearts and in our minds. I think we interact with gratitude in this really unique way. I think that we feel sometimes like I need something new to be grateful now. Like I need something new. Like what is it today that I'm grateful? What's the thing that happened today? What's the thing that I got? Or the relationship that's being successful today, or whatever it is. We feel this sense of I need something new to feel grateful now. Rick, they're coming for you, man. It's like, I know you sit under those umbrellas so they can't track you, but they're here, man. You got to get the tinfoil hat out. And you know, one of the challenging things for us, because kind of culturally, there's a sense that gratitude comes when things are going well, that thankfulness comes when things are well, when things are going our way. But in 2020, and not even taking COVID into kind of consideration, this isn't I'm not intending this to be like a slam on culture, but we are more connected to bad news than anybody ever has been. It's impossible to not hear bad news in a day. I mean, if you think about it, if you go back 100 years or maybe 500 years, or I don't know, even just 40 years, you wouldn't get half of the bad news updates that we get today. And the human frame was never meant to kind of bear the weight of the world's problems. And so for us in our culture, you know, if we work under this understanding that I will be thankful when there's good things happening, or when I have enough good things happening, when I get enough good things, it equates into thankfulness. The reality for us is that we cannot compete with the number of challenges and difficulties that the world is facing and that we are all aware of on a daily basis. We cannot compete with that. And so we can't just wait to be grateful until enough good things happen. We have to figure out a different path, a different way forward. Gratitude is so central to how God designed us to live. But I think it can really only be achieved when we realize and remember what we do have, what God has given us, and the life that we get to live. When we lose track of what we have, when we forget about who we are, we begin looking for another life. When I forget about the blessings that I have here, it makes me start to look around and say, well, what else is there out there? When I forget about the goodness of the relationships that I have, it makes me start to look up and say, okay, what other relationships, where else can I feel good about myself? When I start to forget about the way that God has provided for me, or the realities that we have to have church outside, but look at this. I mean, this is like the best way to have church outside. This is about as good as it gets. But half of us are furious that we have to be out here. And at the same time, we can say, you know what? Like, what an amazing thing. I could be in Idaho. They have service at the same time as us, so they're not watching. I can say these things. Throughout the scripture, there's a word that shows up over and over and over, especially in the Old Testament. When God is speaking to Israel, God's children, he uses this word over and over again. It's this word, remember. It's such a crucial word for them to remember. And it shows up in all kinds of different ways. He tells them to remember where they came from, to remember what it was like, to remember what God has done, to remember who they once were. This word remember is over and over again. God is commanding people to remember where they've been and what they've seen, to remember what's been done for them, to remember who God is. This remembering is what gives them a foundation of gratitude to stand on, even when the current situation is brutal, when the current situation is difficult, when there's not anything new to feel grateful for now. They had a foundation that they remembered all that God had done. And it fueled this sense of thankfulness and gratitude in them, even when the immediate circumstances left much to be desired. This reality of remembering was crucial for them. And it wasn't just these commands. They actually had all of these festivals. And if you guys have read the scriptures, you may have heard about different festivals that they would have, like Passover and things like this. And all of these festivals were meant to remind them of different things about who God was, what he had done for them, who they were, the relationship that he wanted to have. This idea of remembering was crucial, and it was so beneficial for them. There's a story specifically I want to look at today about a man named Joshua. Most people, you may be familiar with Joshua. Most people are familiar with a guy named Moses. He led Israel out of slavery. Then he led them into the wilderness, and they were lost, wandering the wilderness for 40 years. And long story short, Moses was not going to lead them into the promised land. His successor was a man named Joshua. And Joshua was the one that was going to lead Israel into the promised land. And Joshua's first task was to take hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of thousands of Israelites across the Jordan River into the promised land. And the Jordan River, it was not that big of a river. Its normal kind of depth and width was not really anything to be that crazy. So you can imagine, all of the nation of Israel, and they don't have necessarily a specific number, but historians say it was somewhere around 1 million people. But even if we just say it's hundreds and hundreds of thousands of people, that's a lot of people. That's more people than are at a Black Friday sale. That's a lot of people. Joshua is supposed to take them across the Jordan River. At this time, it happened to be at the flood stage. And so this river now would be about 10 to 12 feet deep and about 140 feet wide in certain places. And in Joshua chapter 3 is where we're going to jump into this story. In verse 14, it says, "So when the people broke camp to cross the Jordan, the priests carrying the Ark of the Covenant went ahead of them." Now, the Ark of the Covenant was where God dwelled at this point. So when the Ark of the Covenant was there, that was visually, it was telling them, God is with us. God is here in the midst of us. This is kind of God's dwelling place with us right now. So the Ark, God goes ahead of them. The Jordan is at flood stage all during harvest. Yet as soon as the priests who carried the ark reached the Jordan and their feet touched the water's edge, the water from upstream stopped flowing. As soon as the priests who were carrying the ark, their feet touched the water upstream, the water just stopped flowing. And it says the priests who carried the ark of the covenant of the Lord stopped in the middle of the Jordan, and they stood on dry ground, while all of Israel, hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of thousands of people, passed by until the whole nation had completed the crossing on dry ground. It was a crazy experience, a crazy story. Of course, it's not the first time that Israel had crossed a body of water on dry land in their story. But this crossing from the wilderness into the promised land, this kind of crossing over this threshold into a different promise, a different reality of what God had set up for them. After everybody crosses over, in Joshua chapter 4, verse 18, the priests finish crossing over themselves. It says, "No sooner had they set their feet on the dry ground than the waters of the Jordan returned to their place, and they ran at flood stage just like before. And Joshua set up at Gilgal the 12 stones they had taken out of the Jordan. He had said to the Israelites, 'In the future, when your descendants ask their parents, what do these stones mean? Tell them, Israel crossed the Jordan on dry ground. For the Lord your God dried up the Jordan before you until you had crossed over. It's almost like snow.
It's great.
I didn't think we had fall in California, but here we are. This is a crazy story to me because what's ultimately happening is that they're crossing over this river, and there's a miracle there. But what I want to look at and what I want to focus on is this idea, these 12 stones that God commanded them to take out of the river, and they set them up. And Joshua says, in the future, when your descendants, when your children's children's children ask, hey, what's up with this pile of stones here? As a side note, when we were driving to Utah, we drove, I don't know what freeway it was, but there was like these crazy piles of stones. They were all painted different colors. And I literally said, what's up with those stones? So, like, it's pretty accurate. Like, this is what happens when you see a pile of stones. It's like, hey, that doesn't look like that's supposed to be there. I don't know if it was an Instagram spot at this place specifically, but anyway, so Joshua says when people see these and they ask, what are these meant to remind us of? Remind us, remembering. Tell them Israel crossed on dry ground. For the Lord your God dried up the Jordan before you until you had crossed over. These stones were a monument. They were a reminder of what God had done, of who they were and the way that God would continue to meet their needs. They were thankful in the moment, but I think that there was a sense of understanding that we need to hold on to this for years to come. Because the crazy thing is, this is like the beginning of a hard journey. They made it into the promised land, but literally, as the chapter goes on, the next place they show up is at the doorstep of Jericho, which was another battle. And it was battle after battle for Israel. It's not like they set these stones up because they crossed the finish line and everything worked out and the credits start rolling in the movie. This was the beginning of the next chapter of challenges. And they said, we want to remember this so that regardless of what happens in the future, when we see this, we're reminded of God's goodness. We're reminded of how he has provided, of where he has brought us from, of how he has shown up in our lives. Even if everything is falling apart then, when we see these stones, we can remember of who God is and what he has done for us. It wasn't that they would have new fuel necessarily. It's when there was nothing new to be grateful for in those moments, they were able to look back. And for us, I think it's so crucial that we start to realize what this means for us and start to figure out how do we begin to apply some of this to our own lives, because honestly, it can be days and days or weeks and weeks, and it can feel like everything is hard. Everything is frustrating. Nothing is going the way I want it to go. My relationships aren't the way. My work isn't the way. The finances, whatever it is, health-wise, governments, politicals, quarantines, all these things. There's a million things that can go less than we want them to. It's so crucial for us to not depend on something new to feel grateful now, but that we can start to remember God's done so much already. And when we remember, when we look back and remember, it fuels this sense of gratitude in us today. When we remember who God is, who we are, where we've been, it fuels gratitude. When we remember where we've come from, we aren't so ungrateful about not being further along today. When we remember who we used to be, we aren't so ungrateful about the flaws that we still have. When we remember how God has provided for each of our needs in the past, we aren't so ungrateful for what he has given us today. When we remember, it cultivates contentment in our hearts, which is key to living a thankful life. In 1 Timothy chapter 6, he writes, godliness plus contentment is great gain. It doesn't say godliness and wealth, godliness and wisdom, godliness and living in Orange County. It says godliness plus contentment is great gain. This is such a beautiful gift. And thankfulness and contentment go hand in hand. And so I just want to spend the last few minutes that we have talking about these two ideas and giving some practical ways that we can continue to cultivate this, because we don't always have something new to feel grateful for. Sometimes we are so overloaded with the news feed and the social media feed and the whatever it is that it's hard to feel a sense of gratitude and thankfulness. So how do we begin to find this in our own hearts? So thankfulness and contentment. Thankfulness, the definition of thankfulness is that thankfulness says, I want what I have. I would love for you guys to say this with me so loud that I can hear you over the airplane. So on 3, I want what I have. 1, 2, 3.
I want what I have.
That's pretty good, you guys. Wow. Now you guys watching at home by yourselves, say, I want what I have. I can't hear you, but I can see you. Just kidding. That'd be creepy, right? I want what I have. Thankfulness says, I want what I have. Do you guys know who the most thankful people in the world are? Coffee drinkers. Because in the mornings, they walk out of their bedrooms looking like Baby Yoda, just like wrapped up and kind of frail. And then they get their cup of coffee and they smell it, and their eyes open for the first time in the day. And then they taste a little bit of it, and then they say, ah. And everything is better. It's like their own personal little campfire that they don't have to feed, that Chris isn't in charge of keeping running. Coffee drinkers, they have this beautiful experience where this thing, and it's funny and it's silly, but it's so true, and it does something, and it just makes you feel. And that's what thankful people do. They're thankful. They want what they have when they see their home or their car, or where they see their job, or whether they see their coworkers on a Zoom call or whatever it is. It says, I want what I have. I am thankful for what I have. This is what thankfulness looks like. 1 Thessalonians 5 says, give thanks in all circumstances, for this is God's will for you in Christ Jesus. He doesn't say give thanks for all circumstances. He says in whatever circumstances you find yourself in, you should give thanks. Because there is always something to be grateful for, even if these circumstances are terrible. When we remember, when we look back, when we recognize, there's a sense of being able to say, I am thankful for what I have. And the reality for many of us that we have a hard time understanding is that if we're not thankful for what we have now, we will never have thanks and gratitude for what we have then. It's not about the specific things, it's an attitude. And so there's 2 practical things to help kind of continue to cultivate thankfulness in our hearts, for us to continue to learn how to remember what God has done for us. The first one is by keeping a version of a gratitude journal. And I think Moses may have talked about this a little bit last week, but there's power. Studies after studies have found the power, the impact of writing down what we are grateful for. Some people say 5 things a day. Some people say 10 things a day. At night, we ask our boys, what are 3 things that you're grateful for? Helicopters, flight paths. The power of writing down, of saying what we are grateful for, it's the same thing as putting those stones in a pile. It's a memorial. It's a way to remember, to look at and be able to say, I am grateful because look at what I have. Look at what I've experienced. Look at what we've been through, how far we've come. The second practical thing that we can do to help cultivate thankfulness in our own hearts is by helping others. When we take what we have, even if at times it feels like it's not quite enough, or it's not quite what we want, but when we take what we have and we say, I'm going to give a portion of this to help someone else. I'm going to give a portion of my time. I'm going to give a portion of my money. I'm going to give a portion of my passions, my skills. I'm going to give back a portion of this. There is a holy exchange that happens when we give a portion of ourselves, that we get so much more back. We are so much more filled than we were when we started. These are just a couple practical things. Thankfulness says, I want what I have. And contentment says, I don't want any more. Contentment, the definition of contentment is that I don't want any more. I want what I have. I don't want any more. Now, this is difficult because if we're being honest, which I try to be at church on Sundays between 9 and 11:30, there is always more. There is always something more. And it's not that some of these things that I want more of are necessarily bad things or they're broken things, but this idea of contentment allows me to just take a breath and say, I don't want any more. What I have is enough. And if I needed more, then I have to trust that God would provide it for me. It doesn't let me off the hook for working hard and putting in effort. But there's this reality that God knows what my needs are, and He has promised to meet each of our needs. Who is more content? The man with 5 kids or the man with $5 million? The man with 5 kids, because he doesn't want any more. It's as easy as that. There's this reality that contentment is this sense of, man, I don't want any more. I don't need any more. What I have is enough, and I trust that God continues to provide for me. In Philippians 4, Paul is writing this letter to a church, and he's writing this letter from prison. He is in prison writing these words. He says, I know what it is to be in need, and I know what it is to have plenty. I've learned the secret of being content in any and every situation, whether well-fed or hungry, whether living in plenty or in want. He says, I can do all of this through Christ who gives me strength. The reality for us is that we can figure out how to be content with plenty or with a little, with plenty of food or with a little bit of food, with a small apartment or with a huge house, with a house in rainy, dreary Idaho or an apartment in beautiful, sunny California. We can learn to figure out contentment. We can find that place because of the strength that we have in Christ, because of the ability to know, man, God is my provider, and He has promised to meet every one of my needs, so I can find contentment. And for Paul, it's in the middle of a jail cell writing a letter with no real sense of hope about his future other than Christ. We can have this same aspect, this same type of contentment. And contentment is not an achievement that we reach. It's not a place we finally get to. Contentment is an attitude that we learn. Because the reality is if we cannot figure out how to be content where we are, then we're never going to be content the next place. It doesn't matter how much more you get. It doesn't matter how much less you get. If we can't figure out how to have an attitude of contentment where we are at, we will never be content in another spot. And so there's 2 practical things I want to give just on how to cultivate contentment and how to fight for contentment in our hearts. The first one is to fight back against when and then thinking. I don't know if you guys have heard this phrase before, but when and then thinking essentially is this thought process that says, when I blank, then I blank. When I eat pizza, then I will be happy. Or whatever you want to fill the blanks in with. This idea of when I have or get or arrive to or hear, when I this, then I will be happy. Then I'll be fulfilled. Then I will feel successful. Then I will feel beautiful. Then I will feel loved or valuable or whatever it is. This is such a broken way of thinking, because what it ultimately means is that we cannot be whole or fulfilled until something happens that we have no control over. It means that we're leaving our sense of wholeness and fullness and value, our sense of worth. We're putting all of that in this idea of something that we don't have yet. And one day, fingers crossed, if I get there, then I'll be happy. Then I'll be able to be a good spouse. Then I'll be able to work less when I make that. And when I make this, get this raise, get this promotion, then I'll be able to stay home more. This is a broken way. We have to fight against those thoughts. And the second one is close to it, but the second activity, the second battle that we have to fight is to stop comparing ourselves with others. We have to stop comparing our realities, our lives, our families, our homes with other people's, our experiences with other people. Because when we have this idea of comparing what I have to what they have, it causes us to not feel content. It starts to erode away at thankfulness. It starts to creep into our hearts, and we start to judge others. Either why do they have those things that I want and I don't have them, or man, I'm a lot better than they are. Like, it works both ways. Comparing ourselves with others is a huge challenge. And so here's the reality for us, is that we have got to understand, what does it mean to remember? It's time. It's my timer, you guys.
Okay.
Let's pray. No. What does it mean for us to remember? What does it mean for us to choose to say, regardless of what the current circumstances are, I remember who God is. I remember where he has brought me. I remember the way he has shown up in my life. I remember the way he's provided for me. I remember the way that I have felt cared for, that I've felt known. I remember the way that he has put people in my life. When we remember, it fuels the fire of gratitude, even when we find ourselves in a season or a year or whatever, where it feels like there's just not much to be grateful for, which of course is not true. But oftentimes we get so lost in the weeds because of the amount of information that we have. And traditionally, when we head into Thanksgiving week and Black Friday sales and Christmas parties and wish lists and dinners and recipes and gatherings, which I know all of that looks different this year, but we add in all of these additional challenges to our hearts to remember, what does it mean to be grateful for what we have. We add in all these additional challenges, these additional puzzle pieces, and this season has the potential to make us forget about what we have. This season, this time of year has the potential to overwhelm us with what still needs to be done and what we still have to get and what we still have to prepare for, and this kind of constant out-of-breath feeling for the next 5 weeks of trying to catch up. So crucial that we find ourselves an opportunity now to say, I'm going to choose to remember who God is, where he's brought me from, what rivers I have crossed, the battles that he has fought for me, the ways that God has provided for me. And as we remember these things, it will fuel that sense of thanksgiving and gratitude in our own hearts. Let's pray together.